All right, so welcome back. So this is going to be part 4 in our integumentary system lecture. And in this part, we're going to finish by wrapping up and talking about the dermis. And then in the next parts, we'll talk about more underlying tissue and accessory structures. So the dermis is going to be generally divided into 2 parts. So we said that our epidermis was the more superficial part, and it had 4 or 5 different layers, depending on where you're looking at. Our dermis is going to be similar, okay, but in the sense that we're just going to have more than one layer to it, but these layers are going to be consistent throughout the body. Okay, so one layer is going to be called the papillary layer, and one is going to be called the reticular layer. Okay, so if we look at an image here, we see our epidermis above, right? We see these epidermal ridges coming down. We see dermal papillae coming up. This is probably a section of thick skin, it looks like. And here we see the 2 layers of our dermis. So one is called the papillary and one is called the reticular, right? So if we look at the papillary first, this is called the papillary layer because it contains these dermal papillae, okay? Now this is made up of loose or areolar connective tissue with collagen fibers and elastic fibers. So if you think back to histology, we had collagen fibers and we had these loose connective tissues with lots of cells and elastin fibers stretching out. This is what we find in the papillary layer. Okay, so as you're studying the histology, when you see the loose or areolar connective tissue, think, okay, that's what we find in the papillary layer of the dermis. All right. Now, it's going to be consistent and kind of in contact with, not consistent necessarily, but in contact with the underlying reticular layer of the dermis. Okay. With this papillary layer, we're going to have lots of things here. Okay, we're going to have nerves, we're going to have sensory receptors, we're going to have blood and lymphatic vessels, and because of the presence of these blood vessels, the dermis is going to be able to help regulate our internal body temperature by dilating and constricting the blood vessels to allow more or less blood to go to the surface, to allow more or less heat to be lost. Okay. It's also going to support the overlying dermis, right? So the dermis is going to be lying, the overlying epidermis. The dermis is underneath, right? And sitting on top of it is the epidermis. So the dermis has a big role in supporting the epidermis above, right? Okay, and then the next layer is the reticular layer, okay? So the reticular layer is more deep, all right? And it's made of dense, irregular connective tissue, all right? So if you recall, dense, irregular kind of had that marbled appearance to it. It had lots of collagen fibers with some elastic fibers, but the big thing with this one, if you recall, the collagen fibers were oriented in a number of different directions. Some were oriented vertically, some were oriented horizontally, some were kind of obliquely, kind of all throughout, okay? This is a very tough layer of skin. It's sitting underneath the papillary layer, and this can produce what are called cleavage lines, okay? And we'll look at cleavage lines here in a few slides or so, okay? And then down here, we also find blood vessels, we find nerves, accessory structures, lymphatic vessels, sensory receptors, things like that, okay? So when you look at the blood vessels in the skin, in the dermis, we said that this can help with the dissipation of heat, okay? So during times that our body temperature is increasing or we need to get rid of some additional heat that we have, we can vasodilate, we can dilate our blood vessels. They come closer to the surface, and by coming closer to the surface, some of that heat is able to be lost through the skin, through the epidermis, and so this helps to lower our body temperature. And then conversely, during times in which we want to retain heat, right? We'll have more blood stay deep within the dermis, less come to the surface, and so we have less loss of heat through the skin. So you can see here you have these bands of smooth muscle. In this case, they're very relaxed, allowing lots of blood to come to the surface. And in this case, the band of smooth muscle is very tightly constricted around this vessel, so less blood comes to the surface, more stays deep, and we lose less heat here. This is a good way to see this for yourself is whenever you work out or you do something physical or you're outside on a hot day doing something, you'll notice that the blood vessels in your hand, the venous, a lot of the veins will come to the surface, and you will appear very vascular, right? And you'll have lots of blood vessels at the surface. This is an example of this in which the blood flow to the skin is going to increase to help dissipate and release some of that additional heat in an effort to keep you in homeostasis and to keep your body temperature stable. Okay. All right. We said that also in the reticular layer, you can have these things called cleavage lines. Okay. So if you, and we all know this, if you look down at your hands, you look at the palms of your hands, you notice all of those lines kind of running in various directions, right? This is a result of the collagen fibers in that reticular layer of the dermis. So we had the epidermis, and then the dermis, we had the papillary and reticular layer. In the reticular layer, you have lots of collagen fibers that run in various directions, and it results in these kind of creases that we see throughout our body. Now, we also have cleavage lines throughout other parts of the body, not just on the palms of our hand, and they're generally oriented in a certain direction. Okay, they kind of all go into one area. And so, if you look at this image down to the right, and this one kind of up here, you see different areas of the body have different orientations of these collagen fibers. Okay, and so if an incision is made, um, it is preferable to make that incision parallel to the cleavage line as opposed to across it or as opposed to perpendicular to it. Okay. So if you make it perpendicular to it, like this image up here, this top one, if you make it perpendicular, as those collagen fibers kind of contract and as they are pulling and providing and producing tension, they can cause that incision to gape. Okay. So in other words, they can cause it to open up. So you can see here, collagen fibers are providing tension and producing tension in either direction that can cause this to open. If you make the incision parallel to it, there's not that opposing tension that's trying to open up the incision because it's made parallel with it. So this means that incisions made or cuts that are parallel to the cleavage lines typically heal better with less scar tissue and less noticeable scarring and faster, whereas incisions made perpendicular to it tend to produce more scar tissue and may take a longer time to heal. Okay. And then the last kind of associated thing are stretch marks, right? So we've all heard of stretch mark. This occurs when you have a very rapid increase in weight, when you have a rapid increase in the distension and the stretch of the skin that actually tears and causes the elastic fibers to actually burst. Okay, so they have some degree of stretch, right? So we know that they can stretch out and then they can recoil. But if you, it's like if you have a slinky, like a metal slinky. If you ever used one of those as a kid, you have your slinky and you stretch it out nice and long and it recoils. But then you stretch it out too far and it becomes stuck, right? You stretch it just to the point to where it's unable to go back to its normal shape. And when that happens with elastic fibers, you get these things called stretch marks, right? And so an example, a good example of this is what happens during pregnancy, right? Because of the rapid increase in weight, the rapid distension of the skin of the stomach, those elastic fibers stretch an incredible amount and they ultimately tear and burst. And what's left behind are these kind of pink, kind of reddish marks that you see that are indicating the stretch marks that are where the elastic fibers have bursted where they have torn, right? Now, they won't always remain this dark kind of red purple color. They can heal, and as they heal, they kind of turn a more light kind of white color, all right, as they heal, all right? So that is the end of this part. We'll pick up with the kind of part 2 of our overall integumentary system lecture, which will be part 5 of our series of videos. So I'll see you in that video.